Hazel McBride drove the pen straight through Raymond Cross's desk and left it standing there, quivering, buried 2 inches deep into the oak, with every man in that land office watching and not one of them breathing. The deed they'd handed her, the one they'd spent 3 days pressuring her to sign, smiling, offering coffee, calling her ma'am with teeth showing, lay in 2 pieces beside the pen. She'd torn it clean down the center. "You forged the grantor signature," she said. "Page 3, line 8. The man whose name you used has been dead for 11 months. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. If this story already has your heart beating faster, please take 1 second and hit that subscribe button right now and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Every comment means the world to me." Now let's go back to the beginning, because what happened in that land office on a Tuesday morning in November of 1883 didn't start with Hazel McBride picking up a pen. It started 6 weeks earlier, on a train platform in Cincinnati, Ohio, when a woman with $22 in her coat pocket and a leather satchel full of legal documents made the worst and best decision of her life. The advertisement had read simply, "Office manager needed. Land acquisition firm, Cibola County, New Mexico Territory. Knowledge of legal documentation preferred. Wages $20 monthly plus board. Serious inquiries only. Apply to R. Cross, Commissioner's Office, Delwood." Hazel had read it 4 times. Then she'd cut it out of the paper with her late husband's letter opener, the one she'd kept even after his brother stripped the house of everything else, and she'd folded it into the front pocket of Thomas's old law satchel, the one piece of his practice she'd refused to surrender. 4 years of marriage to a Cincinnati attorney had given her something no inheritance law in Ohio could take away. She could read a contract faster than most lawyers could open the envelope it came in. She knew what a quitclaim deed looked like, what an encumbrance clause meant, how to spot a date altered by a different hand in a different ink. Thomas had taught her the work because he trusted her eye more than his own on detail work. His brother had called her the help at the funeral. She'd said nothing then. She had nothing left to say things with. She wired ahead, received confirmation, bought a ticket. The train ride west took 4 days. She used the time to read the New Mexico territorial land statutes she'd borrowed from the Cincinnati Law Library the week before. 3 volumes, worn at the spines, annotated in someone else's pencil. She made her own notes in the margins in ink. Precise, dated, cross-referenced. She arrived in Delwood on a Wednesday, mid-morning, the sky the color of old pewter and the wind coming off the mesa like something with a grudge. The town was smaller than the advertisement had implied. 1 main street, a handful of side streets, a courthouse that needed paint, a bank that didn't. She stood on the platform with her satchel and her 1 traveling bag and looked at all of it and thought, well, here we are. The land office was on the south end of Main Street, a solid building, newer than most, with a painted sign that read, "Cibola County Land Commissioner, R. Cross, Esquire." The door was open. She went in. Raymond Cross was not what she'd expected. He was 60, or close to it, with a neat gray suit and spectacles, and the kind of unhurried manner that came from years of being the most important person in every room he entered. He stood when she came in. He smiled. He offered his hand. "Mrs. McBride, welcome to Delwood. You made excellent time." "The train was on schedule," she said. She shook his hand once. His grip was the kind that wanted to demonstrate something. "I trust the journey wasn't too taxing?" "It was fine." She set her satchel on the chair beside her, without being asked to sit. "I'd like to understand the scope of the position before we discuss terms. The advertisement said land acquisition. What specifically does that mean in practice? Cross had looked at her then, with something she couldn't quite name yet. Not surprise exactly, more like recalibration. Straightforward enough. We process land transfer documents for the county. Buyers and sellers, grants, deeds, the usual. You'd be managing the filing systems, preparing documentation for signature, corresponding with territory offices in Santa Fe. Preparing documentation for whose signature? The parties involved in each transaction. And who verifies the documentation before it goes out? There was a pause. Brief. A half-second she didn't catalog correctly until much later. That would be part of your responsibilities, Cross said pleasantly. Which is precisely why we needed someone with your background. He introduced her to two other clerks, a young man named Gerald, who never quite met her eyes, and a middle-aged man named Horton, who smiled too readily. He showed her the filing room, the correspondence ledgers, the cabinet where deed transfers were stored. Everything was organized. Everything looked correct. She'd known enough fraudulent paperwork in her years at Thomas's firm to understand that the ones that looked most correct were the ones worth looking at hardest. He gave her until Monday to settle in. Said he'd arranged board at Mrs. Paulson's, 2 blocks north. Said Monday morning would be soon enough to begin. She'd thanked him with a steady voice and walked out into the New Mexico wind and stood on the boardwalk for a moment with her satchel over her shoulder and the sensation, distinct and particular, of a door closing behind her before she'd had a chance to see what was in the room. She found Mrs. Paulson's without difficulty. Her room was small and clean, with a window that looked south toward the mesa. She unpacked her 2 dresses and Thomas's satchel. She set the legal volumes on the windowsill. She lay down on the bed with her boots still on and stared at the ceiling and thought about the pause. That half-second when she'd asked who verified the documentation. She thought about it for a long time. Saturday she walked the town. She was precise about it, methodical, the way Thomas had taught her to walk a new courtroom district. What was there? What was missing? What didn't match? The bank was the largest building. A hardware store, a general dry goods, a doctor's office with a hand-lettered sign, a saloon, a small apothecary that also seemed to function as something else, given the number of women coming and going at hours that didn't suggest purchasing medicines. She stopped at the apothecary. A small sign above the door read, Nora's, medicines, remedies, lying in. The woman behind the counter was Chinese-American, 50 or thereabouts, with steady hands and the kind of eyes that had seen enough of the world to stop flinching at it. New in town? The woman said. It wasn't a question. Since Wednesday. Hazel McBride. I'm working at the Land Commissioner's office. There was a pause then, too. A different kind. Not the calculating pause Cross had given her. This one was careful, considered. Nora Sung, the woman said. What do you need today? Headache powders, and maybe some information, if you're inclined. Nora studied her for a moment. Then she reached under the counter and set a paper packet on the surface. Information about what? About Raymond Cross. Nora's hands went still. Then she picked up a bottle from the shelf behind her and turned to face Hazel fully. That's not a question most people ask their first week. I'm not most people. No, Nora said slowly. I don't suppose you are. She set the bottle down. Come back Sunday morning, early. I'll have coffee made. Hazel paid for the headache powders and walked back to Mrs. Paulson's in the November wind. She sat at her window that evening with Thomas's land statute volumes open on her lap and started reading the section on deed transfers in organized territories. She read until midnight. She found 3 things that interested her and wrote them in the margin of her notebook, in the careful, dated script Thomas had made her practice until it was second nature. Then she closed the book, turned off the lamp, and slept better than she had in months. Sunday morning, she went to Nora Sung's back door, as instructed. Nora was already up, coffee on the stove, a small fire going in the corner stove that heated the back room. 2 cups on the table. "Sit down," Nora said. Hazel sat. "How much do you know about what that office does?" "What they told me. What I suspect. I don't have documentation yet." Nora poured coffee, set a cup in front of Hazel, sat down across from her. 17 families in the last 4 years, she said. Small ranches, homesteads mostly. They come to me when someone's sick, when a baby's coming, when there's a bone that needs setting. I know every family in a 40-mile radius. She wrapped her hands around her cup. 14 of those 17 families no longer own their land. They signed papers they thought were routine filings, extensions, renewal notices, tax adjustments, reasonable-sounding things. And 6 months later, there's a new deed of record with a different name at the top. Hazel kept her voice even. Did any of them consult an attorney? Nearest attorney is 60 miles north in Las Cruces, and by the time they understood what had happened, the record in Delwood showed the transfer as legal and registered. There was nothing to argue with. The paper said they'd signed. And had they? Nora looked at her steady. Some of them. They thought they were signing something else. Some of them, I don't believe they signed at all. Hazel set her coffee down. The man Cross hired before me. What happened to him? A long pause. Left town suddenly, 3 months ago. Horton said he took ill. Gerald said there was a family emergency. Mrs. Paulson told me the man's room was cleaned out in one afternoon and nobody saw him go. Nora drank her coffee. He was a young man, seemed nervous though. The week before he left, he came in here asking about land records in Santa Fe, how to request copies, whether a territorial court could overturn a county filing. And you told him? I told him what I knew, which wasn't much. I'm not a lawyer. She looked at Hazel directly. But you are, as near as makes no difference. I'm a clerk. You came in here and asked about Cross in your first week. You came back on Sunday morning with the right questions. That's not a clerk. That's someone who knows exactly what they're looking at. Hazel thought about that. Thought about Thomas. About the way he'd said more than once that the best legal minds he'd known weren't the ones who argued loudest in court. They were the ones who read a document so carefully it gave up everything it was trying to hide. I need to see those deed transfers, Hazel said. The originals, not the recorded copies. The documents the grantor actually signed. And how do you intend to do that? I'm the office manager starting Monday morning, Hazel said. I manage the files. Nora studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, she smiled. It was not a comfortable smile. It was the smile of a woman who had been waiting 4 years for someone to walk through her back door with the right questions. There's one more thing you should know, Nora said. Cole Whitaker. He runs a cattle operation 6 miles east of town, and he's the unofficial land witness for half the county. People bring him in when they want a neutral party for a transaction. He's been suspicious of Cross for 2 years. He's also the reason the last 3 attempts to run squatters off the Bellamy homestead didn't succeed. Cross hates him. Why hasn't he done anything? Because he has no proof. He knows land, but he doesn't know documents. He can tell you when a fence line is wrong, but he can't tell you why the deed that established it is fraudulent. Nora refilled Hazel's coffee without asking. He needs someone who can read what he can't. And I need someone who knows the land, Hazel said. Yes, said Nora, you do. Hazel walked back to Mrs. Paulson's in the early morning cold, with the coffee warming her from the inside and the weight of what she'd just heard settling into her bones. Not the fearful kind of weight, the other kind. The kind Thomas used to describe as the moment a case became real, when the abstract became particular, when the names on the documents became faces, when the legal problem became a human problem that the law existed to solve. She spent Sunday reading the territorial statutes on fraudulent conveyances. She read them twice. Then she took out a clean sheet of paper and started writing out what she would need. What documents? What dates? What comparisons? What would constitute proof that a court in Santa Fe could not ignore? She slept 4 hours, woke before dawn, dressed carefully in her blue-gray frontier dress, the one with the practical sleeves she could push up to work. She took Thomas's satchel. She walked to the land commissioner's office in the gray Monday morning and waited outside until Cross arrived at 8 o'clock precisely and unlocked the door. "Mrs. McBride, punctual. I appreciate that." "I'd like to begin with the deed transfer files," she said. "Get a sense of the filing system before I start handling current documentation." "Of course." He gestured her in. "Gerald can show you the cabinet organization." Gerald showed her. His hands shook slightly as he opened the first drawer. She didn't comment on that. She just started reading. She read for 3 days straight. She ate lunch at her desk. She was pleasant to Gerald and Horton and answered Cross's occasional questions about the filing system with exactly the right amount of competence. Enough to seem useful, not enough to alarm him. She took no notes in the office. She memorized instead, the way Thomas had taught her. Dates and names and discrepancies stored in careful sequence. Each evening, she walked back to Mrs. Paulson's and wrote everything down in her notebook, encrypted in the personal shorthand Thomas had developed for sensitive casework. On the third day, she found it. Buried in the third drawer, a deed transfer filed 11 months ago. Grantor listed as one Robert Aldine. 50 acres of river bottomland transferred to a holding company named Cibola Land Associates. Cross's company, though the name didn't appear directly. The transfer was witnessed, stamped, recorded. Everything correct. Except Robert Aldine had died 12 months ago. Hazel had found his death notice in the county record she'd quietly requested from the courthouse clerk on Tuesday afternoon, while Gerald thought she was at lunch. The man who signed the deed had been dead for a month before the deed was dated. She sat with that for a long moment in the quiet of the filing room on a Wednesday afternoon, the November wind pressing at the windows. Then she closed the drawer and went back to her desk and continued working with the same steady pace she'd maintained all week. On Thursday morning, Cross handed her a document, thick paper, official letterhead, a deed of transfer for 43 acres belonging to a man named Webb Connolly, active homesteader, Nora had told her, with a wife and 3 children and a water right that was worth more than the land itself. "I need this processed today," Cross said pleasantly. "Mr. Connolly will be in at 2 o'clock to sign." Hazel took the document. She set it on her desk. She opened it and read it the way she read everything, line by line, clause by clause, and on page 3, line 8, she found the notarization from the grantor's previous transaction. A reference filing meant to establish the chain of title, signed by one H. Aldine as property witness. H. Aldine, the wife of Robert Aldine, the dead man, signed as witness to a transaction dated 4 months after her husband's death in a county she'd left 3 months before that. Hazel knew because she'd seen the forwarding address request in the courthouse file. She read it again, carefully. Then she took the document, walked to Raymond Cross's desk, picked up his letter opener, and drove it through the page and into the oak surface beneath with a force that came from 3 days of carefully controlled fury and 4 years of being told that what she knew didn't count because she hadn't passed the bar. She tore the deed down the center. She said, "You forged the grantor signature. Page 3, Line 8. The man whose name you used has been dead for 11 months. The room went absolutely still. Gerald made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Horton took a step backward. Cross looked at the pen in his desk and then at Hazel, and his expression went through 4 or 5 things in rapid succession before it settled on something cold and professional and far more dangerous than anger. "Mrs. McBride," he said, "I think you may have misread." "I don't misread," she said. "I've got the death certificate date, the filing date, and the notarization date in my head right now, and none of them match what you'd need for this to be legal. Webb Connolly is not signing this document today." "Mrs. McBride," his voice dropped, very quiet, "I think you should sit down and reconsider." "I think you should stop using dead men's names on live documents." The silence was total. Then the office door opened, and the man who came in was not Webb Connolly. He was tall, lean, dark-haired, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of working land under an open sky. And he stopped in the doorway with his hat in his hand and took in the scene before him, the torn document on the desk, the pen buried in the wood, Cross standing rigid, Hazel standing with her back straight and her hands flat on the desk, with the particular stillness of a man who has spent years reading situations before he steps into them. "Whitaker," Cross said, and his voice was very controlled. "This isn't a good time." Cole Whitaker looked at Cross. Then he looked at the torn deed. Then he looked at Hazel McBride, this woman he'd never seen before in his life, standing in Raymond Cross's office with both hands on the desk and the expression of someone who has just done an irreversible thing and is not sorry about it. "What did he have you sign?" Cole said. Not to Cross, to her. "Nothing yet," Hazel said. "That's the problem he's currently having." Cole looked at the torn deed again. He set his hat back on his head slowly. "Is that the Connolly transfer?" "Was," Hazel said. He nodded once, a short, definitive motion, like a man confirming a thing he'd already known for a long time. Then he looked at Cross with an expression that had no anger in it, which was somehow worse than anger. "Raymond," he said, "I'd think real careful about your next move." "You have no authority here, Whitaker." "No," Cole agreed, "but she's got a torn deed with your pen in it, and I've got a real good memory for faces. And there's about to be 30 people walking past that window on their way to the noon meal at Morrison's." He turned back to Hazel. "You got somewhere safe to be right now, ma'am?" Hazel picked up Thomas's satchel from beside the desk. She pulled the pen out of the oak surface, set it beside the ruined deed, and said to Cross, with perfect clarity, "I'll be needing copies of the filing records for the last 4 years. All of them. You can have them ready by Friday, or I can explain to the territorial court in Santa Fe why they aren't available." She walked to the door. She stopped beside Cole Whitaker. "I'm Hazel McBride," she said. "I believe we have a mutual acquaintance. Nora Sung said you need someone who can read what you can't." He studied her face for a moment. Then he said, "Cole Whitaker, and I reckon Nora was right." He held the door for her. They walked out into the November wind together, and behind them, Raymond Cross stood in his quiet, organized office, with a torn deed on his desk, and the specific kind of silence that falls over a man when he understands that the threat he dismissed has just become the most dangerous thing in the room. The wind hit them both the moment they cleared the doorway, cold and direct, the kind that didn't negotiate. Hazel kept walking. Cole matched her pace without being asked, which she noted and filed away the same way she filed everything, quietly, precisely, for later use. "Where are you staying?" he said. "Mrs. Paulson's, North End." "Not anymore." He said it flat. No drama in it, just fact. "Cross will have someone at Mrs. Paulson's inside the hour." He's done it before. Hazel stopped walking. She turned to look at him. Done what before, exactly? Cole looked back at the land office, then at her. The clerk before you, young man named Peter Graves, left town in a hurry 3 months ago. Or so the story goes. He paused. His room at Mrs. Paulson's was cleaned out the same night he told Cross he had questions about the Aldine transfer. The same transfer she'd found in the third drawer, the dead man's deed. She held that coincidence in her mind for exactly 2 seconds, and then set it somewhere she could find it again. Where do you suggest I go? Nora's got a back room. She's offered it before to people who needed it. You two have a system, Hazel said. We've had 4 years to develop one. He said it without apology. Come on, we'll go the back way. She followed him down a side street she hadn't walked yet, past the edge of the hardware store and behind the church, moving at a pace that was purposeful without being panicked. She appreciated that. Running announced fear. Walking announced intention. You knew about the Aldine deed, she said as they walked. I knew something was wrong with it. I didn't know how to prove it. You knew Robert Aldine? Since I was 12 years old. His wife Helena taught school here for 15 years before she moved to her sister's in Albuquerque. Cole kept his eyes on the path ahead. When that transfer got filed 11 months ago, I went to Cross and said the date was wrong, that Robert had already passed. Cross showed me the filing, pointed to the signature, told me I was mistaken about the date of death, said he had a certificate on file. He didn't. No, but I couldn't prove that without pulling records from 2 counties, and I don't. He stopped. Started again. I know land. I know where every fence line in this county should sit, and when it's been moved 3 inches overnight. I know which water rights attach to which parcels, and which ones got quietly reassigned in filings nobody read. But paper. He said the word like it tasted different from the things he was good at. Paper is its own language. I can follow it, but I can't always catch it lying. That's exactly what it does, Hazel said. It lies in a very specific register that requires a specific kind of reading. They reached the back of Nora's apothecary. Cole knocked twice, a pattern. The door opened almost immediately, which told Hazel that Nora Sung did not rattle easily and had likely been watching the street since Monday morning. Nora looked at them both, then at the satchel, then at Hazel's face. How bad? I tore the Connolly transfer and put Cross's letter opener through his desk, Hazel said. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she stood back and held the door open. Come in, both of you. The back room was small and warm and smelled of dried herbs and camphor, and something underneath that was just clean wood and old books. Nora set a kettle on without asking. Cole sat in a chair by the window where he could see the street. Hazel set the satchel on the table and opened it and took out her notebook. I need to tell you both exactly what I found, she said. And then I need to understand what we're working with in terms of who in this town can be trusted and who can't. Shortlist, Cole said. For the trusted side, I've worked with shortlists before. Hazel opened the notebook to the page she'd written Sunday night after leaving Nora the first time. Robert Aldine died 13 months ago. The deed transfer for his river bottom land is dated 2 months after his death. The document shows his signature. It also shows a notarization witness, H. Aldine, his wife, Helena. Helena Aldine left Delwood 10 months ago. She signed as witness, according to that document, to a transaction that occurred 7 months after she left the county. Cole's jaw tightened. She never signed it. No. Someone copied her signature from an earlier legitimate document in the file. There's a slight variation in the H that a person reading quickly wouldn't catch. But the pressure pattern is wrong. Whoever copied it pressed harder on the downstroke than Helena did. Hazel turned a page. The Comely transfer I tore today used the same methodology. Different names, same technique. The witness signature on page 3 was pulled from a 2-year-old filing and duplicated. I could see it because I'd been reading originals for 3 days straight, and the paperweight was slightly different. Nora set cups on the table and sat down. How many transfers do you think are fraudulent? I don't know yet. I need the originals, not the recorded copies. The recorded copies in the courthouse are the cleaned versions. They don't show the anomalies. The originals should still be in Cross's filing cabinet. She looked at Cole. Can you get me into that office tonight? Cole looked at her steadily. You mean break in? I mean retrieve documentation of crimes before it disappears the way Peter Graves disappeared. She held his gaze. You said the clerk before me left town suddenly. How certain are you that leaving was his choice? The silence that followed was the particular kind that forms when someone finally says aloud a thing everyone in the room has been thinking and not saying. Cole looked at Nora. Nora looked at her cup. Not certain at all, Cole said quietly. Then we move tonight, before Cross has time to pull the originals and replace them with clean copies, or remove them entirely. Hazel closed the notebook. I also need to know about Deputy Frank Aldridge. Nora mentioned him Sunday. Young, honest, no proof. Is he trustworthy enough to approach? Frank's good, Nora said. He's been deputy 2 years, and he's wanted to move on Cross for 18 months. The problem is jurisdictional. County fraud of this scale technically requires territorial authority. A deputy can't make that arrest without a territorial marshal's warrant, and getting a warrant requires documented evidence submitted to the court in Santa Fe, which is exactly what I'm building. Hazel tapped the notebook. Once I have the originals, and I've documented the signature discrepancies with a systematic comparison, that's an evidence package a territorial court can act on. It's not fast, but it's solid, and solid is what makes it stick. Cross won't wait for solid, Cole said. He knows what you found today. He knows you can read it. He's going to move. Then we move faster. Hazel picked up her cup, drank, set it down. Tell me about the families, the 17 Nora mentioned. How many of them are still here, still on the land they think they lost? Nora and Cole exchanged a look. 8 families, Nora said, still in the county. Some of them gave up and moved off their homesteads, thought the legal transfers were genuine and they had no recourse. 3 families are still on the land, staying on as tenant labor for the holding company that now owns the deed, paying rent for land their parents homesteaded. The words settled into the room with a particular weight. Hazel had heard that specific kind of legal cruelty before. In Thomas's office, in cases that came through from mining towns and railroad disputes. The kind where everything on paper was technically correct, and everything in practice was theft. I want to talk to those families, she said. All 8, as soon as possible. But tonight first. She looked at Cole. Can you get us in? Back window on the east side doesn't latch properly, he said. Cross knows about it, but he's never fixed it because the filing room is interior. You'd have to know the layout to find anything in the dark anyway. He paused. How well do you know the layout? Well enough. She turned the notebook to a blank page and drew the office floor plan from memory. Desk positions, cabinet numbers, drawer configuration. In 30 seconds of clean, precise lines. She turned it to face him. Cole looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then he looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically. Not the way it happened in stories where realizations came with weather changes and significant pauses. It was quieter than that. The look of a man who has been carrying a problem for 2 years and has just understood for the first time that the problem might actually be solvable. Third cabinet, bottom 2 drawers, Hazel said. That's where the originals are stored separate from the recorded copies. They're filed chronologically, not by grantor name, which is unusual. It suggests Cross organize them for his own reference, rather than for legitimate office use. Why does the organization matter? Because legitimate deed files are organized by property, by grantor name, by parcel number. You'd want to find a specific property quickly. The only reason to organize by date is if you're tracking a sequence of transactions. If the documents are steps in a plan rather than independent records. She tapped the drawing. He knows exactly what he has in those drawers. He knows the order, which means if anything is removed, he'll know immediately. So we photograph, not remove, Nora said. We copy. Hazel reached into the satchel and produced a small leather roll, opened it on the table. Inside, a fine nib pen, 2 bottles of copying ink, and a stack of thin, translucent paper, the kind used for legal tracings. I can make exact duplicates of any document in that office in under 3 minutes per page if I have good light. The copies will hold up as evidentiary exhibits because the paper and ink are standard legal grade. I bought them in Cincinnati before I left, specifically for this kind of work. Cole stared at the copying kit. You came here expecting this. I came here expecting to find something wrong, Hazel said. The advertisement was too specific about legal documentation knowledge and too vague about everything else. That combination usually means someone needs a clerk who can read enough to process paperwork without reading closely enough to understand what it means. She rolled the leather case back up. They chose poorly. Nora made a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly contained. Cole sat back in his chair and was quiet for a moment, looking at the street through the window. Then he said, My son is 14. He's at the ranch with my foreman right now, and he doesn't know I'm in town. He paused. If this goes wrong, if Cross moves on me the way I think he wants to, someone needs to know where he is. Hazel looked at him. That sentence, offered without self-pity and without drama, landed somewhere it wasn't entirely comfortable. A man calculating risk, not for himself, but for who would be left if the risk went badly. Thomas had never had to think about that. She had never had to think about it on behalf of another person. What's his name? She said. Daniel. All right. She held his gaze steady. Then we do this correctly, which means we do it tonight, quickly, and we don't leave anything in that office that tells Cross what we copied. And we do it with enough documentation that the case reaches Santa Fe before he can bury it, and Daniel's father is standing in a courthouse in 30 days rather than running from one. Cole looked at her for a long moment. The wind pressed at the window glass. The stove ticked. Outside, Main Street was going about its noon business. Horses and voices and the ordinary sounds of a frontier town that didn't know what was sitting in the back of its apothecary. You really think 30 days, he said. I think 20 if the territorial court moves at the pace they're legally required to. And I think Raymond Cross makes a mistake in the next 72 hours, because men like him always do when they're frightened. And frightened men's mistakes leave paper trails. She put the copying kit back in the satchel. The question isn't whether we can prove this. The question is whether we can move fast enough to protect those families while we're proving it. Nora stood, went to the shelf behind her, took down a small tin box and set it on the table. Webb Connolly will be at that office at 2 o'clock today, expecting to sign a deed for his own land. When he doesn't find Mrs. McBride there, and when Cross tells him there was a paperwork delay, Webb will be confused and probably frightened. She opened the box. Inside, a folded paper and a small brass key. This is the key to my storage room. Webb Connolly's wife Martha comes to me every Thursday for her mother's heart tonic. If I send word to the Connolly homestead today, they'll be here before dark. She looked at Hazel. They need to hear from you directly. Not from me, not from Cole. From the woman who tore that deed this morning and can explain in plain language what it means. "I'll talk to them," Hazel said. "And the others," Nora said. "The 8 families. Some of them have stopped believing anyone can help them. Some of them signed things they still don't fully understand. They need to understand before this goes to Santa Fe, because a territorial court will want to know whether the grantors acted under duress or genuine misunderstanding. And the answer to that question shapes the entire case." Hazel opened her notebook to a new page. "Give me their names." Nora gave them, all 8, with the particular detail that came from 20 years of knowing a community, not through official records, but through the intimate geography of illness and birth, and the things people said when they were scared and someone trustworthy was in the room. Each name came with a history: which families had small children, which had elderly parents who couldn't relocate, which had water rights that made their parcels specifically valuable to Cross's holding company. Hazel wrote every word. Cole filled in the land boundaries when Nora's knowledge stopped at the fence post. Between the two of them, they gave her more than she'd have found in a month of filing records. By the time the kettle had cooled and the afternoon light had changed against the window, Hazel had 4 pages of notes in her careful shorthand, and the beginning of a case architecture she could see clearly. Not complete, not yet, but structured, logical, built on a foundation of specific documented facts rather than suspicion. She closed the notebook. She looked at both of them across the table. "Tonight, then. After 10. Cole, I need you at the east window. Nora, I need Martha Connolly here before 6 if you can manage it." "I'll send Tommy Reeves," Nora said. "He's 12 and fast, and he knows every back road in the county." "Good." Hazel picked up the satchel. The weight of it was familiar and right. The same weight it had carried through 4 years of Thomas's practice, through the weeks after he died, through the train ride west with the territorial statutes open on her lap. Different contents now, the same purpose. "One more thing," she said. "Cross is going to tell people I misread that document, that I'm a hysterical woman who destroyed county property and should be removed from the position." "He already is," Cole said. "Gerald was out the side door before we reached the corner. Half the town will have heard a version of it by supper." "I know," Hazel stood. "So let him talk. Every version of that story he tells is a version he can't change later when the evidence says something different. Let him build his case on my incompetence." She looked at Cole directly. "Because the thing about men who dismiss a woman's ability to read, they stop watching what she's writing." Cole held her gaze. That shift was in his expression again, the same quiet recalibration she'd seen in Cross's office when he'd looked at the torn deed, except where Cross's had gone cold and calculating. Cole's did something else. It acknowledged something, confirmed something he'd been deciding since the moment he'd walked into that office and found her standing at the desk with both hands flat on the surface and not 1 inch of retreat in her posture. He nodded once, picked up his hat. 10 o'clock, he said. "East window. Don't bring a lantern. I'll have one." He moved toward the back door. Then he stopped. "Mrs. McBride," he turned back. "Whatever you think Cross might do tonight, between now and 10, he's going to do worse than you think. He always does." He said it not as a warning, but as a professional assessment, the same way she delivered the facts about the Aldine deed. Plain, precise, without unnecessary weight. "Just so you know what we're walking into." "I appreciate the honesty," Hazel said. "You'd have figured it out anyway," he said, and he went out the back door into the afternoon wind, and she heard his boots on the packed earth, and then nothing. Just the town going about its business on the other side of the apothecary wall. And Raymond Cross somewhere inside it, building his story about the woman who couldn't read. While she sat at Nora Sung's table with 4 pages of shorthand that said exactly the opposite. Martha Connolly arrived at Nora's back door at 5:30, with mud on her boots and her husband's rifle across her back, and 3 children she'd left with a neighbor 2 miles down the road because she hadn't known what she was riding into and hadn't wanted to find out with them watching. She was 41 years old and had the particular kind of stillness that belonged to women who had held things together so long that stillness had become structural, load-bearing, the thing everything else leaned on. She sat down across from Hazel and put her hands flat on the table and said, "Tell me the truth, all of it. I've had enough of the other kind." So Hazel told her. She opened the notebook and she walked Martha Connolly through every line of what she'd found, not softened, not translated into gentler language, because Martha had asked for the truth, and the truth was what Hazel had. The forged witness signature, the dead man's name on a live document, the way Cross had designed each transfer to look routine, to feel like paperwork, to arrive in a woman's hands or a tired farmer's hands at the end of a long day when reading closely felt like more effort than it was worth. Martha listened without interrupting. When Hazel finished, Martha was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The paper they had Webb sign 2 years ago. The one they said was a tax adjustment filing." "That's the one." "He signed it at the land office. Cross was there. Horton was there." Webb said it felt strange, but Cross explained it 3 times, and Webb's not a man who likes to seem ignorant, so he signed. Martha's voice stayed level, but her hands on the table pressed down harder. "They already own our land." On paper, the deed of transfer is filed in Cross's cabinet, but a fraudulent transfer can be voided by a territorial court if we can prove the grantor's signature was obtained under false pretense, or that the documentation itself was falsified. Hazel turned the notebook to face her. "Do you remember anything specific about what Cross said to Webb when he explained the document? Any specific language?" Martha thought. "He said it was a routine encumbrance renewal. Said every property in the county needed one filed every 5 years, or the original homestead grant became technically unregistered. Said it was nothing, just bureaucratic housekeeping, and he'd take care of all the actual filing himself." Hazel wrote that down. "He told you the filing was something it wasn't. That's misrepresentation-inducing signature. That alone is grounds for voiding the transfer in a territorial proceeding." She looked up. "Webb never intended to transfer the property. He thought he was keeping it." "Then that's what we tell the court." Hazel closed the notebook. "But I need you to understand what this means in practical terms. I'm building an evidence package for submission to the territorial court in Santa Fe. That process takes time, weeks, not days. During that time, Cross still holds the filed deed, which means technically, legally, your water rights and your grazing rights are vulnerable. He can move to exercise them before the court rules." Martha looked at her without flinching. "And if he does?" "Cole Whitaker is going to make sure he doesn't." Hazel said it with more certainty than she'd verified. But she'd been reading people since Thomas first put her to work interviewing clients, and she had read Cole Whitaker accurately enough in 4 hours to know that a man who kept track of a widow's forwarding address from 2 counties over because something felt wrong about a deed filing was not a man who would watch a family lose their water rights while a court took its time. Martha held her gaze. "You barely know Cole Whitaker." "No, but I know what he's been doing for 2 years without enough tools to finish it." Hazel set the pen down. "He needs this evidence, and those families need someone to present it correctly. That's what I'm here for." Something in Martha's posture shifted. Not softened. Nothing about Martha Connolly softened easily, and Hazel respected that, had recognized it the moment the woman sat down. That earned rigidity that came from years of protecting something. But it adjusted, recalibrated. The way Hazel's own posture adjusted when a legal argument she'd been holding with both hands finally found its structural logic. "What do you need from me?" Martha said. "A written statement. Your account of the conversation with Cross, as detailed as you can remember it. Dates, language, who was present. I need it in your own handwriting and signed. Hazel pushed a clean sheet of paper across the table. Tonight, if you can. I need it before 10 o'clock. Martha picked up the pen without ceremony and started writing. Hazel left her there with Nora and walked back to Mrs. Paulson's through the early dark, taking the long route Cole had shown her, staying off Main Street. She packed her things quickly, the 2 dresses, Thomas's volumes, the satchel. She'd traveled light enough coming west that leaving took 8 minutes. She left the room key on the pillow and went out the back way and returned to Nora's without seeing anyone who concerned her, which she didn't take as reassurance. Cross had 2 hours before 10 o'clock, and 2 clerks who knew her face, and a town where strangers stood out in the dark. She found Nora in the front room with the lamp turned low, working on something at the counter, with the quiet efficiency of a woman accustomed to doing careful work in low light. Hazel set her bag in the corner and sat down with a notebook and went back through everything she'd written in the last 3 days, looking for the gaps. There were 2 she couldn't fill from memory alone. The first was the chain of title on the Bellamy homestead. Cole had mentioned it outside the office that morning, said he'd stopped 3 attempts to run squatters off it, which meant the Bellamy family was either still fighting or had been fighting until recently. She needed to know which transfers in that sequence were legitimate and which weren't, and that required the original filings. The second gap was Cross himself. She understood his methodology, the forged signatures, the misrepresented document purpose, the careful organization by date that mapped the sequence of his own crimes. What she didn't fully understand yet was the holding company, Cibola Land Associates. The name appeared on every fraudulent transfer as the receiving party, but a holding company in a territory required registration, required principals, required some documented connection to real money moving through real hands. Someone was buying this land through Cross, and someone was paying him to acquire it. The fraud wasn't the end. It was the mechanism. The question was what the land was ultimately for. Nora, she said without looking up from the notebook, the families who lost their land. Where is their land, specifically? What's distinctive about the parcels? Nora came to the table and looked at the map Hazel had been sketching. Not the office floor plan this time, but a rough layout of the county as she understood it from 4 days of reading deed descriptions. Show me what you have. Hazel showed her. Nora took the pen and added notations. Homestead locations, water sources, the road that connected Delwood to the Southern Territory. When she finished, they both looked at it. The pattern was unmistakable. Every parcel that had transferred to Cibola Land Associates sat along a corridor 10 miles wide, running northeast to southwest across the county. Not random, not opportunistic. Deliberate, systematic land acquisition along a specific geographic line. There's talk, Nora said quietly. Has been for 2 years. A railroad spur. The main line goes north of us, but there's been surveyors in the county twice in the last 18 months. Nobody official confirmed anything. A railroad spur through this corridor would require right-of-way acquisitions from every landowner along the route, Hazel said. If Cross holds the deeds to those parcels through the holding company before the railroad announces the route, he sells at railroad prices, which are 10 times what the land is worth to a homesteader. Nora sat down. And the families who used to own it get nothing. Hazel wrote the words "railroad corridor" at the top of the page and underlined them twice. This was no longer a county fraud case. This was a territorial land scheme backed by railroad money, which meant Cross had financing behind him, and likely legal representation in Santa Fe that would complicate a territorial court filing considerably. She was still working through the implications when she heard the sound. Boots on the back steps, more than one set, and then a knock that was not Cole's pattern. Two sharp, close together, then a pause, then one more. Nora stood, moved to the back door, looked through the gap in the curtain. Then she opened it. Deputy Frank Aldridge came in, hat in hand, 29 years old and looking like he'd run at least part of the way. Behind him, a man Hazel didn't recognize. Broad-shouldered, 40 or so, with honest dirt on his clothes and the kind of face that had been carrying bad news long enough that it had settled into the lines around his eyes permanently. "Webb Connolly," the man said to Hazel directly, without preamble. "My wife sent word to come." "She's in the back room," Hazel said. "She's writing a statement. Sit down." She looked at Aldridge. "You came with him." "Heard there was trouble at the land office this morning," Aldridge said. He sat down without being asked, put his hat on his knee, looked at her with the particular directness of a young man who was tired of knowing a thing was wrong and not having the tools to address it. "I also heard Cross told Morrison this afternoon that you'd had some kind of episode. Said you attacked county property and had to be removed. Said the paperwork issue was a misunderstanding by an inexperienced clerk." He paused. Morrison believed him. I didn't. "Why not?" "Because Horton came into the saloon at 4 o'clock and drank 3 whiskeys in 40 minutes. And Horton doesn't drink." Aldridge looked at the notebook on the table. "And because Gerald left town on the evening stage, which he's never done on a workday in 2 years. Gerald was gone." Hazel absorbed that. Gerald, the nervous young clerk with the shaking hands, who had shown her the filing system on her first day and had not met her eyes for the 3 days since. Gerald, who had been there long enough to know everything. Gerald, who was apparently also frightened enough to run. "Was he on Cross's payroll beyond his clerk's salary?" she said. "I don't know, but he knew things." Aldridge leaned forward. "Mrs. McBride, I need to ask you directly. What did you find in those files?" She told him. She told him the way she'd told Martha, precisely and completely. And she watched his face move through the same sequence of confirmation, the look of a man hearing the proof of what he'd suspected, which was different from surprise because surprise was open, and this was the closing of something, the completion of a shape that had been missing its last piece. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I can't arrest Cross on what you've told me tonight. I need the originals." "I know. We're getting them tonight." He looked at her. "We. Cole Whitaker and I." Aldridge was quiet again, a different kind of quiet. "Cole's been trying to move on this for 2 years, and Cross knows it. If Cole's seen anywhere near that office tonight—" "Cole won't be seen," Hazel said. "He'll be at the window. I'll be inside." She held Aldridge's gaze before he could object. "I know that office. I know exactly which drawer, which files, which documents. It will take me 40 minutes at most. Cole is there for the window latch and for anything that goes wrong afterward." She paused. "What I need from you is simpler. I need you to be somewhere visible tonight, somewhere Cross or his people would expect to find you, so that when we talk about tonight later, you have an alibi that isn't complicated." Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Murphy's Saloon runs a card game on Tuesday nights. I'm usually there by 9. Be there by 8:30, Hazel said. "And if Cross approaches you tonight about me, tell him you heard his version at Morrison's, and it sounded reasonable. Give him nothing to worry about from your direction. You want me to lie to him. I want you to manage information strategically," Hazel said, "which is different from lying, in the same way that a deed of transfer is different from theft. On paper they can look identical, but the intent is entirely opposite." Webb Connolly, who had been sitting with his hat in his hands and listening to all of it, made a sound that might have been a short, rough laugh. Aldridge looked at the ceiling briefly. Then he put his hat back on and stood. 8:30, he said. "Murphy's. And Mrs. McBride, whatever you pull out of that office tonight, don't bring it here. Comes looking. This is the second place he'll check. Where do you suggest? My office has a false bottom in the evidence locker. Nobody knows about it but me because I put it there myself 6 months ago, when I started thinking I was going to need it. He said it with the quiet pride of a young man who had been planning for a contingency he hoped would never arrive, and was genuinely relieved it hadn't been wasted effort. I'll leave it unlocked from 10 to midnight. Back entrance on the alley side. After he left, Hazel stood at the table for a moment and looked at everything she'd assembled in one day. Martha Conley's written statement, now in Nora's back room, reaching its second page. The notebook with 4 days of observations and tonight's new information about the railroad corridor. The copying kit in the satchel. The map with Nora's notations. The names of 8 families. 1 deputy with an unlocked evidence locker and 2 years of waiting for something to be done right. She thought about Thomas. Not with grief, not anymore, but with the particular clarity that came from distance. The way you could finally see the shape of a mountain once you were far enough from its base. Thomas had been a good lawyer and a good man, and he had believed, genuinely believed, that the law protected people. She had believed it too, until his brother had stood in their front room with a document and a pleasant expression, and walked out with everything Thomas had built. And the law had watched with complete indifference, because the document was properly filed, and the signature was technically valid, and intention didn't matter once the paper was in order. That was the thing Cross was counting on. That paper was final. That what was filed was what was real. That a woman who could see the lie in the document couldn't do anything useful with that knowledge, because useful required authority, and authority required credentials, and credentials were things men held. He was wrong about that last part. She'd known he was wrong about it since the moment she'd torn the deed down the center. The authority wasn't in the credentials. It was in knowing exactly what the paper said, and being willing to stand in front of a territorial court and say it clearly and without flinching, while Cross's attorney tried to make her seem like an excitable widow who'd misread a routine filing. She'd been prepared for that argument since Cincinnati. She'd been preparing for it, without knowing its specific shape, since the day Thomas's brother walked out with the house. At 9:45, she picked up the satchel and said goodnight to Nora, who pressed a small oil lantern into her hands, the low-burn kind that threw minimal light and could be shuttered to near dark in a second, and said nothing else because there was nothing useful left to say. The night was cold and clear, stars hard and close, the way they were in high desert dark. She took the back route to the land office, moving without hurry, her boots quiet on the packed earth. She could see her own breath. Somewhere east of town, a dog barked once and went silent. Cole was already at the window when she arrived. He materialized from the shadow of the building's east wall so smoothly she would have missed him entirely if she hadn't known where to look. He said nothing. He held the window frame while she worked the latch with the thin-bladed tool she'd brought for the purpose. And when it gave with a click that sounded enormous in the night silence, he boosted her up and through without ceremony, his hands solid and certain under her boots. And she was inside. The office smelled of paper and lamp oil, and the particular cold of a room that had been locked all day. She shuttered the lantern down to its narrowest aperture, just enough to navigate by, and moved to the third cabinet. She opened the bottom drawer. The files were there. She found the Aldine transfer in under 30 seconds. She knew exactly where it sat in the chronological sequence because she'd been looking at it in her memory for 3 days. She pulled it, opened the copying kit, and began. Her hands were steady. They had always been steady under pressure, which was one of the things Thomas had valued and his brother had never understood about her, that she did not become less precise when the stakes increased. She became more precise, the way a good pen responded to a firm and practiced hand. She was on the 6th document, the web-comly transfer, when she heard the front door of the land office open. Not the window, the front door, with a key. She shuttered the lantern completely, pressed back against the filing cabinet in the total dark. Heard footsteps cross the front room, slow and deliberate. The footsteps of a man who was walking his own office and was in no hurry because he believed himself entirely alone. A light appeared under the filing room door, getting brighter, moving toward her. Raymond Cross put his hand on the filing room door and pushed it open. The light from Cross's lantern swept across the filing room and found Hazel McBride standing against the 3rd cabinet with the copying kit open on the floor beside her and 6 completed document copies in her left hand and the original web-comly transfer in her right. Neither of them moved for a full 3 seconds. Then Cross stepped into the room and closed the door behind him with the careful deliberateness of a man who had decided something before he opened it. He set his lantern on the cabinet shelf. He looked at the copies in her hand. He looked at the originals spread on the floor. He looked at her face. And what he found there apparently wasn't what he expected, because his own expression shifted slightly. Not to anger, but to something more considered, more calculating. The face of a man running numbers. "I thought you might come back," he said. His voice was conversational, almost pleasant. "You're too thorough to leave without finishing." "Put the lantern down and step back," Hazel said. Her voice came out level. She was grateful for that. Not because she was afraid. She was afraid. She wasn't a fool about what this moment meant. But because level was more useful than afraid right now. "There's no need for that kind of talk," Cross said. "We're 2 professional people in a land office. Nothing dramatic about it. You forged 17 property transfers, and you're in the process of selling a railroad corridor you acquired through fraud. There's considerable drama about it." Something moved behind his eyes. Quick, controlled, gone. He hadn't known she'd found the railroad connection. She watched him recalibrate and stored that reaction carefully, because a man who recalibrated instead of denied was a man who was deciding what he could still protect. "You're a clever woman, Mrs. McBride," he said. "Cleverer than I anticipated, which I'll admit freely. The advertisement should have asked for less specific qualifications." He tilted his head slightly. "But clever and right aren't always the same thing, and right without power is just noise. Power like a territorial court warrant? Power like the attorney in Santa Fe who has been managing Cibola Land Associates' legal standing for 3 years and who has significantly more courtroom experience than a widow with a copying kit." He said it without heat, informational. "I'm not threatening you, Mrs. McBride. I'm explaining the landscape." "I appreciate the honesty," Hazel said. "It saves time." She kept her eyes on his face and her hands on the documents, and her attention split between him and the east window 10 feet to her left, which was where Cole was, which Cross didn't know. "Here's the landscape from my side. I have 6 completed copies of your fraudulent transfers, made on legal-grade copying paper with evidentiary ink. I have a written statement from Martha Connolly documenting misrepresentation-inducing signature. I have the original death certificate dates cross-referenced against your filing dates in my notebook, which is not in this room. And I have the pattern of acquisition along the railroad corridor, documented in a format a territorial judge can read in under 10 minutes. She paused. Your attorney in Santa Fe is going to need to be very experienced indeed. Cross looked at the documents in her hands for a moment. Give those to me. No. Mrs. McBride, still pleasant, Still the voice of a man explaining something to someone who hadn't fully understood yet. "I have no desire to cause you difficulty. You came here looking for work. You found something you didn't expect. That's an unfortunate situation, and I bear some responsibility for it." He took one step toward her. "Give me those documents and walk away from Delwood tonight, and I will make sure you have enough money to start somewhere else entirely. Somewhere with better opportunities. This county isn't the right fit for your abilities." "My abilities are doing fine here," Hazel said. She took one step sideways, putting the cabinet at her back. "Don't come closer." He took another step. "You're alone in this office at 10 o'clock at night with documents that belong to the county. Whatever you think you found, the story I tell about tonight is considerably simpler than the story you're trying to tell. A grieving widow, displaced, some might say unstable, broke into a county building and tampered with official records." He spread his hands, a gesture of regret. "That's a criminal charge, Mrs. McBride. That's removal from the territory. That's the end of whatever you thought you were building here." "Or," said Cole Whitaker from the east window, which he had opened without sound at some point in the last 30 seconds, "it's the night Raymond Cross got caught in his own office with a woman who can prove every one of his crimes, and a territorial deputy whose card game at Murphy's just ended early." Cross turned. Cole was through the window and standing in the room before Cross completed the turn. Not rushing, not dramatic, just present. Tall and certain, and looking at Cross with the expression of a man who had been waiting 2 years for this particular moment, and had decided to let it arrive without ceremony. Cross's pleasant manner did not collapse. Hazel noted that with professional attention. Men who panicked were dangerous in one way. Men who stayed pleasant when they should have panicked were dangerous in another, and usually the worst kind. "Whitaker," Cross said. "Breaking and entering, criminal trespass. I can add your name to the complaint alongside hers." "You could," Cole said. "Except Frank Aldridge left Murphy's 20 minutes ago, and he's standing outside your front door right now with a lantern and a legal right to enter county property on official business, which is the kind of thing a deputy can do." He didn't move toward Cross. Didn't need to. And what Hazel's got in her hand is enough to open a territorial investigation that your Santa Fe attorney is going to have real difficulty managing once the railroad company understands that the land acquisition they've been financing is built on fraud. Because railroad companies don't enjoy being accessories to land theft, Cross. Makes the investors nervous. Cross was quiet for a moment. The calculating look was fully visible now, no pleasantness covering it. He was running every remaining option and finding each one shorter than the last, and Hazel watched him do it, because watching a man count his options was itself information. It told you which ones he thought were still open. He looked at the copies in her hand one more time. Then he said, "You'll never get a Santa Fe court to move on this in time. The railroad survey is complete. The right-of-way acquisition closes in 6 weeks. Whatever you submit will still be working its way through territorial procedure when the last deed transfers." 4 weeks, Hazel said. He looked at her. "That's how long it will take. Not 6. I've read the territorial court filing procedures for fraud cases 3 times. An emergency petition citing ongoing harm to identifiable parties jumps the standard queue. It requires documentation of at least 3 fraudulent transactions with supporting evidence, a sworn statement from a territorial officer, and a filing fee of $12. She held up the copies. "I have documentation of 6 transactions. Deputy Aldridge will swear the statement. And I have $14 in Thomas McBride's old coat pocket." She kept her voice even and factual, the same register she'd used to read the Connolly transfer aloud in this same building that morning. Because what she was doing right now was the same thing. Reading the document exactly as it was written, without flinching from what it said. You have 4 weeks, Mr. Cross, not 6. And the families whose land you stole have a legal advocate who knows exactly which procedural buttons to push in which order. The front door of the land office opened. Frank Aldridge came into the front room, lantern up, hand resting on the sidearm he hadn't drawn and didn't need to draw. He stopped in the filing room doorway, took in the scene. Cross, Hazel, Cole, the documents on the floor, the copying kit, with the calm of a man who had rehearsed this moment enough times in his imagination that the reality of it felt almost familiar. "Mr. Cross," Frank said, "I'm going to need you to step into the front room." "On what authority?" Cross said. "Still controlled, still precise. County Deputy Authority under New Mexico Territorial Code, Section 14, which allows a law officer to detain a person at a scene where documentary evidence of a crime is present and in risk of destruction." Frank looked at Cross steadily, "which I learned about 3 months ago when I started reading the territorial statutes." "Ma'am," he looked at Hazel, "are those documents secure?" "They are now," Hazel said. Cross went into the front room without being physically compelled, which Hazel noted as the choice of a man who was still calculating, rather than a man who had surrendered. And calculating men needed watching more carefully than surrendered ones. Frank positioned himself between Cross and the door, with the practiced ease of someone who had learned which way people moved when they decided to run. Cole looked at Hazel. "You all right?" "Yes." She knelt and picked up the remaining originals from the floor, squared them precisely, returned them to their drawer in the exact order she'd found them. Then she gathered the 6 completed copies, pressed them flat, and slid them into the satchel between Thomas's volumes, where their weight settled against her ribs like something that had been missing from that exact space for years. "The railroad corridor," Cole said quietly. "You're certain?" "The acquisition pattern matches a northeast-southwest route that would connect the main line to the Southern Territory mines. Every parcel Cross holds through the company sits directly on that line. Someone with railroad money has been funding him, and he's been delivering the land." She closed the satchel. "I need to get to Frank's evidence locker tonight, and I need to wire Santa Fe first thing tomorrow morning to confirm the emergency petition process before I file." "Post office, you don't need to be there." "No," he said, "I don't need to be." He said it the same way he'd said everything else, plain, without decoration, without asking her to read something into it that he wasn't putting there directly. "But I know the territorial postmaster in Las Cruces personally, and he can route a wire to the court clerk's office directly, rather than going through the standard relay, which cuts 6 hours off your confirmation time." He paused. "Useful or not?" "Useful," she said. In the front room, Cross had sat down in his own chair, with the expression of a man who had accepted temporary containment as a strategic choice rather than a defeat. He watched Hazel come through the door with the satchel, and he watched Cole come through behind her, and he said, to Hazel specifically, "You know this doesn't end with a filing, Mrs. McBride. The people behind this acquisition aren't county officials. They don't respond to territorial court procedures the way Raymond Cross does." "I know," Hazel said. "That's why I'm not stopping at the territorial court." He looked at her. "The Railroad Commission in Washington has a fraud division," she said. "They exist specifically because land acquisition fraud along projected rail routes has become a national problem, significant enough to warrant federal attention. A documented case with 6 supporting transfers, a clear acquisition pattern, and a railroad corridor map is exactly the kind of thing they open files on." She looked at Cross directly. "Your Santa Fe attorney is experienced with territorial proceedings. He may not have the same depth of experience with Federal Railroad Commission investigators." Cross said nothing. For the first time since she'd met him, he said absolutely nothing. And that silence was the most honest thing she'd heard from him. Frank walked them out. The night was still cold and clear, the stars unchanged, the town around them quiet in the particular way that frontier towns went quiet after 10, deeply and completely, as though the dark was something people respected rather than just the absence of light. Hazel stood on the boardwalk outside the land office with a satchel over her shoulder and let out a long, slow breath that came out visible in the cold air. "Evidence locker," Frank said. "Now, before anything else." They went. The three of them through the back alley to the deputy's office, a small building beside the courthouse that smelled of gun oil and old paperwork, and the coffee Frank had apparently been drinking in large quantities, given the state of the pot on the stove. He opened the evidence locker, lifted a false floor panel that had been installed with real craftsmanship. Hazel noted the clean joinery, the careful fit, and she placed the copied documents inside, wrapped in the oilcloth from her satchel. "I need to wire Santa Fe in the morning," she said, "and I need access to those files again tomorrow to finish copying the remaining transfers. There are at least 4 more in that cabinet I didn't get to tonight." Frank closed the panel, replaced the locker contents over it, locked the door. "Cross is contained tonight. I can hold him on the trespass charge until morning, because, technically, you were in that building first, and he entered after, which is a legitimate legal question. By morning, he'll have someone arguing his release, and I'll have to let him go." He looked at her. "You've got until about 10 o'clock tomorrow morning before he's back in that office." "I'll be done by 8, Hazel said. Cole walked her back to Nora's through the alley. They didn't talk much. There wasn't the need. The silence between them was the comfortable kind. The kind that formed between people who had just done a difficult thing together and were processing it at their own pace, without requiring the other person to fill the space. Hazel had experienced that silence with Thomas sometimes, in the late evenings when a case had broken, and there was nothing left to do but let the day settle. She hadn't expected to find it here, in a New Mexico alley at 11 o'clock, with a man she'd known for 15 hours. At Nora's back door, Cole stopped. "My son Daniel," he said. "I need to send word to the ranch tomorrow morning. Let him know where I am." "Of course." "He'll want to come to town. He'll hear something's happening and he'll want to be here." Cole was quiet for a moment. "He doesn't trust easily. Hasn't since his mother left. And he's going to hear things about you. Cross's version, Morrison's version, the saloon version, before he hears the real one." Hazel looked at him. "How old did you say he was?" 14. "Then he's old enough to read a document and judge for himself." She paused. "Bring him to the wire office tomorrow morning. Let him see the filing process. Let him understand what evidence looks like and what it does." She adjusted the satchel on her shoulder. "A boy who learns that paper can be a weapon and not just a burden is a boy who's harder to cheat for the rest of his life." Cole looked at her for a moment. That same quiet shift she'd seen twice before. The recalibration that wasn't surprise, but was something adjacent to it. The look of a man who kept expecting to reach the edge of what this woman understood, and kept finding it wasn't there. "I'll bring him," he said. "Good." She opened the door. Then she stopped. "Cole, in Cross's office tonight, when he said the people behind this acquisition don't respond the way he does, he meant it. Whoever is financing Cibola Land Associates through the railroad connection has enough money to make a territorial court ruling inconvenient rather than final." She held his gaze. "Once I file that emergency petition tomorrow, this case becomes public record, which means those people know we're moving, and they'll move too. In the next 4 weeks, there's going to be pressure on those 8 families that has nothing to do with paperwork." "I know," Cole said. "I'm not saying we stop." "I know that too." "I'm saying the families need to know what's coming. Webb and Martha, all 8. They need to make informed choices about how visible they want to be before I put their names in a territorial filing." Cole nodded slowly. "I'll ride out tomorrow afternoon. Talk to each of them directly." He paused. "You should come." "I plan to." "Good." He put his hat on. "Get some sleep, Hazel." He used her given name the same way he did everything, without announcement, without significance attached to the moment of it, as though it had always been the natural thing to call her. It landed quietly. She levitt. She went inside. Nora was still up, moving around the back room with the efficiency of a woman who kept unusual hours as a professional matter. Martha Connolly had gone home an hour ago, with her written statement copied in Hazel's hand for the evidence locker, and the original tucked inside her own coat. Nora poured 2 cups without asking. "How bad?" she said. "Cross was there," Hazel said. "We got out with the copies. Frank has them." Nora set a cup in front of her and sat down. "He'll be free by morning." "I know. I'll be done by 8. Nora studied her face the way she studied everything, with the precise clinical attention of a woman accustomed to reading the difference between what a person said and what their body was actually doing. "You're frightened," she said. Not accusatory, observational. "Yes," Hazel said. No point in the other answer. "Good." Nora drank her coffee. "Frightened and moving is better than comfortable and still." Cross has been comfortable and still for 6 years. She set the cup down. "The railroad corridor. You told him you knew." "I wanted him to understand the scope of what I have. Men like Cross respect information more than they respect physical threat. Showing him the full picture makes him recalculate the risk of coming after me directly. Or it makes him move faster." "Yes," Hazel said. "It does both. The question is, which one he leads with." She wrapped her hands around the cup, felt the heat move through her palms. Thomas's satchel sat on the table beside her, with 6 copied documents inside it, and the beginning of a case that was going to be either the most important thing she'd ever built, or the thing that brought the most important people in the territory down on her head. Possibly both, simultaneously. "I spent 4 years after Thomas died being told that what I knew didn't count," she said. "By the bank, by his brother, by every man who looked at my qualifications and saw a widow instead of a lawyer's trained second mind." She looked at the cup. "I am not going to let Raymond Cross or the people behind him add their names to that list." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "No, I don't suppose you are." She stood and moved toward the back room. "Sleep. The cot's made up. I'll wake you at 6. Hazel sat for another moment with the cup and the quiet and the weight of what tomorrow required. Then she opened the satchel one more time, took out the notebook, and wrote 3 careful sentences in the margin of the page with a railroad corridor map. The time, the date, and exactly what Cross had said about the people behind the acquisition, in case she needed to prove later that she'd known from the beginning what she was walking into. She capped the pen, closed the notebook, set it on top of Thomas's satchel, and turned off the lamp. And in the dark of Nora Sung's back room in Delwood, New Mexico territory, she closed her eyes and let herself be, briefly and completely, afraid. Because Nora was right about that. Frightened and moving was better than comfortable and still. And she was going to be moving at first light. Nora woke her at 6, as promised. No ceremony about it. Just a hand on her shoulder, and coffee already on the table, and the gray pre-dawn light coming through the window with the particular quality of a morning that intended to be clear and cold and unambiguous about both. Hazel was dressed and at the table with the notebook open in 4 minutes. She drank the coffee standing, reviewing the sequence she'd worked out in the last hour before sleep had finally taken her. The order of the remaining transfers she needed to copy, the specific language for the territorial court wire, the sequence of family visits with Cole that afternoon. 4 weeks to the railroad acquisition closing. Every hour between now and that deadline was a document, a signature, a sworn statement, a procedural step that either built the case or conceded ground. She was out the back door by 6:15. The land office back window was as she'd left it. She was inside in under a minute and at the third cabinet with the lantern open before the town had properly begun its morning. She worked fast and precisely, the copying pen moving in the steady rhythm Thomas had made her practice until her hand could maintain it for hours without losing accuracy. She did not rush. Rushing made errors, and evidentiary copies were the thing opposing attorneys lived for. She finished the fourth remaining transfer at 7:42. She returned every original to its exact position, closed the drawer, shuttered the lantern, and was out the window and 2 streets away by 7:48. Behind her, the land office looked exactly as Raymond Cross had left it the night before. The only difference was what was no longer exclusively his. Cole was at the wire office when she arrived, and he had Daniel with him. The boy was 14 and had his father's coloring and his father's way of reading a situation before stepping into it. Standing slightly behind Cole's shoulder, with his hat in his hands, and the careful, watchful expression of a young person who had learned that adults in unfamiliar circumstances required observation before trust. He looked at Hazel the way she imagined he looked at most things. Direct, measuring, not unfriendly, but not open either, waiting for information. "Daniel," Cole said, "this is Mrs. McBride." "Ma'am," Daniel said. "I hear you know this county well," Hazel said. He glanced at his father, then back at her. "Some of it." "Good. I may need that later." She set the satchel on the wire office counter and looked at the boy directly. "Your father and I are filing a legal petition today. It's going to go to a court in Santa Fe, and it's going to try to get back land that was stolen from 8 families in this county. Some of those families have children about your age." She paused. "Do you want to understand how it works, or would you rather wait outside?" Daniel looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I want to understand." "Then stay close and pay attention." She turned to the counter. The territorial postmaster, a narrow man named Briggs, who clearly knew Cole and clearly understood that whatever Cole Whitaker brought to his counter before 8 in the morning was not routine, processed the wire with efficient speed. Hazel composed the message herself, standing at the counter, precise, procedural, citing the specific territorial code sections Frank had confirmed the night before, and requesting direct confirmation of the emergency petition queue from the court clerk's office. Cole gave Briggs the routing instruction for the Las Cruces connection, and Briggs sent it within 10 minutes. "Confirmation usually comes back same day if the clerk's office is moving," Cole told her as they stepped outside. "It'll move," Hazel said. "I cited 3 specific code sections and a dollar figure in property value. Court clerks respond to dollar figures." Daniel made a small sound beside her. She glanced at him. He was looking at the wire office door, with the expression of someone filing away a piece of information that had just become unexpectedly interesting. They were back at Nora's by 8:30. Frank Aldridge arrived 12 minutes later with the news she'd expected and had already planned for. Cross had been released at 8 o'clock, as Frank had predicted, by an attorney who had ridden in from somewhere east of town the previous evening, which meant Cross had sent for him last night, which meant Cross had anticipated some version of this outcome and had legal representation already positioned. "His name is Carver," Frank said. "Theodore Carver. I've heard the name before. He does work for land acquisition companies up and down the territory." "Railroad affiliated," Hazel said. Frank looked at her. "Probably, yes." "Then he knows the federal commission process, and he knows Cross's position is more exposed than a purely territorial case, which means his first move will be procedural. He'll try to challenge the legitimacy of the copies before the court has a chance to examine the originals." She was already opening the notebook. "I need to file the physical copies with Frank's sworn statement today. Not tomorrow. Today. before Carver has time to prepare an objection. "The courthouse clerk's office opens at 9, Frank said. "Then we're there at 9. She looked around the room. Cole, Frank, Daniel in the corner with his hat on his knee, Nora measuring something at the back shelf with a quiet competence she brought to everything. "I also need the written statements from the families. Martha's is done. I need the others." "I sent word at first light to 4 of them," Cole said. "Webb will bring them in. They trust him." He paused. "The other 4 are the ones who moved off their land. 2 are in town, 2 are ranching on neighboring properties. They'll need to be approached carefully."
"I'll talk to all of them," Hazel said. "But the 4 who are still here first. This afternoon, after the court filing."
At 9 o'clock precisely, Hazel McBride walked through the front door of the Cibola County Courthouse with Frank Aldridge on her left and Cole Whitaker on her right, and Thomas's satchel over her shoulder and 6 copied deed transfers wrapped in oilcloth inside it. And she set them on the filing clerk's counter and said, in the clear, carrying voice she'd learned from 4 years of working in rooms where people tried not to hear what she was saying, "I need to file an emergency petition for territorial court review. Citation of fraudulent conveyance. Cibola County. 6 documented transactions, with supporting sworn officer statement." The clerk, a young woman who looked startled, then interested, then carefully professional in quick succession, pulled the correct forms without being told what they were called. Hazel noted that with satisfaction.
A clerk who knew her forms was a clerk who paid attention to details, and details were what this case ran on. She was still completing the filing paperwork when Theodore Carver came through the courthouse door. He was 50, well-dressed in the way that spoke of Eastern money, with the kind of composed professional expression that came from years of courtroom work and the specific confidence of a man who had never lost a procedural argument because he'd never faced an opponent who'd read the same statutes. He looked at the filing counter, at Hazel, at the forms in her hand, and he made a rapid calculation that she could see him making, and then he came to the counter and said, pleasantly and professionally, "Mrs. McBride, Theodore Carver, I represent Raymond Cross and the interests of Cibola Land Associates." "I know who you are," Hazel said, without looking up from the form. "Then you understand that the materials you're attempting to file are copies made without authorization from county documents, which is itself a violation of Section 22, Territorial Records Code, which prohibits unauthorized removal of original county documents." Hazel finished the sentence for him, set down the pen, and looked at him directly. "The originals are still in the county filing cabinet, exactly where they belong. I made copies using standard legal copying materials on evidentiary-grade paper, and the copies are what I'm filing, which is permitted under Section 31 of the same code when the originals are county property and the copying was performed for purposes of legal proceeding." She picked up the pen again. "I also copied them on the premises, which removes the unauthorized removal question entirely." She returned to the form. "Was there something else?" Carver was quiet for a moment. "The petition itself is premature. There's a 30-day response period before Emergency Petition Queue, Section 14, Subsection 3. Ongoing harm to identifiable parties. The Connolly family's water rights are at risk of being exercised by the fraudulent deed holder before a standard review completes. That qualifies for emergency consideration under territorial precedent set in Martinez v. Doña Ana County, 1879. She signed the bottom of the form and slid the completed filing packet to the clerk. "You can look it up. It's in the 3rd volume of the New Mexico Territorial Case Record, which I imagine you have in your office." Carver looked at her with the expression of a man who had just discovered that the room he'd walked into had a different floor plan than the one he'd been given. Professionally controlled, not panicked, but recalculating, the same way Cross had recalculated. And she was beginning to understand that the people Cross worked for hired men who recalculated, rather than men who panicked, which made them more dangerous and also, in a specific and important way, more predictable. A man who recalculated could be anticipated. A man who panicked could not. "You'll be hearing from me formally before the end of business today," Carver said. "I look forward to it," Hazel said. She picked up her receipt from the clerk, tucked it into the satchel, and walked out of the courthouse into the November morning, with Frank on her left and Cole on her right, exactly as she'd walked in. And behind her, she heard Carver begin a low, rapid conversation with the clerk that she didn't need to hear because she already knew what it said. "He's going to challenge the emergency designation," Frank said as they reached the street. "Yes, it'll take him until 3 o'clock to prepare the objection properly. By then, the wire confirmation from Santa Fe should be back, and I'll have the family statements." She adjusted the satchel. "Let him file the objection. Every procedural objection he files is a document that says Raymond Cross is trying to stop a fraud investigation, which is itself information the court will consider." Cole said nothing. He was looking at the courthouse door behind them, with the expression of a man integrating a new understanding of how something worked. Daniel, beside him, had the same look in a younger face. The Santa Fe confirmation came back at 12:40. The court clerk's office had accepted the emergency petition classification and assigned it to the territorial judge's review queue, with a scheduled hearing date 22 days out. 22 days. 2 days faster than Hazel had calculated. She was sitting in Nora's back room when she read it, with Webb Connolly and 3 other homestead owners at the table, and their written statements in a neat stack beside her completed copies. She read the confirmation twice. Then she set it down and looked at the 4 men across the table and said, 22 days. That's when the court hears this case. Between now and then, there's going to be pressure on you, on your families. People connected to Cross's railroad financing have money, and they'll use it. That might look like offers, someone coming to you with cash to buy your land voluntarily. It might look like delays at the bank, or problems with your supply accounts, or strangers asking questions about your water rights. She looked at each of them in turn. "I need you to send those people directly to me." Webb Connolly looked at her. "And what do you do with them?" "I write down everything they say, and I submit it to the court as evidence of ongoing pressure to influence witnesses in an active legal proceeding." She let that land. "Every time someone tries to make you walk away from this case, they're building my argument for me." It was 2:30 when Raymond Cross walked into Nora's apothecary through the front door. Not the back, the front, in full view of Main Street, which was its own statement. He came alone, without Carver, without anyone, and he sat down in the chair across from Hazel in Nora's front room and put his hands flat on the counter and looked at her the way a man looks at something he has decided to reassess completely. "Your petition was accepted," he said. "Yes." "Carver's challenge won't succeed." "No, it won't." Cross was quiet for a moment. "I want you to understand something," he said. "Not as a threat, as a fact." He said it the same way she said things, plainly, without emotional decoration, because they were, she thought, in some technical sense, the same kind of person, which was both useful and unpleasant to acknowledge. "The men who are financing this acquisition are not concerned about a territorial court proceeding. They have managed territorial court proceedings before. What they are concerned about is the federal commission angle, because federal investigations create records that don't disappear, and they attach to names that those men have invested significant effort in keeping clean." Hazel held his gaze. "I know. If you pursue the federal commission filing, those men will not respond with lawyers." He said it flatly. I want you to understand the specific nature of what you're choosing." "I understand it." She kept her voice level. "I understood it when I was in your filing room last night, and you told me the same thing in different words. And I understand it now the same way I understood it then, which is that the alternative is 8 families who lose their land and a county where fraud is the permanent operating principle, because everyone who could stop it decided the personal risk was too high." She leaned forward slightly. "I have a deceased husband, Mr. Cross, and no children, and $22 beyond what's in that satchel. The people you're describing have very little leverage over a woman who's already lost everything that leverage applies to." She paused. "But those 8 families have children, have futures, have things worth protecting. Which is exactly why I'm going to file with the Federal Commission tomorrow morning, regardless of what you came here to tell me." Cross looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face moved. It wasn't remorse. She didn't think men like Cross arrived at remorse easily or quickly. It was closer to the particular exhaustion of someone who had calculated every option for the last 18 hours and arrived at the conclusion that none of them ended where he needed them to end. "What do you want?" he said. "Full written disclosure," Hazel said. "Your account of every fraudulent transfer, the methodology, the dates, and the names of the principals behind Cibola Land Associates. In your handwriting, signed and notarized." She let that sit. "In exchange, I go to the territorial court with documentation that shows you cooperated fully from the point of the investigation opening. That distinction matters significantly at sentencing." "You're offering me a deal." "I'm offering you the difference between 10 years and 3, Hazel said, "which is the actual practical difference between a man who serves his time and comes out the other side and a man who doesn't." She held his gaze without blinking. "That's not charity. That's arithmetic." Cross sat for a long time with his hands flat on the counter and the quiet of Nora's front room around them, and whatever calculation he was running moving behind his eyes in the controlled way all his calculations moved. Then he said, "I'll need Carver present." "Bring him at 6 o'clock." Cross stood, put on his hat, looked at her one final time with the expression of a man filing away the specific shape of something he had not expected to encounter. Then he walked out the front door into the afternoon. Cole was in the doorway from the back room. He had heard it all. He looked at Hazel with a quiet recalibration expression and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You were ready for that conversation." "I was ready for that conversation before I got on the train in Cincinnati," Hazel said. She let out a long breath. "He'll bring Carver. Carver will negotiate the specific language." "That's fine. I know what the language needs to say, and I know which concessions are real and which ones are theater." She stood, picked up the satchel. "I need 2 hours." "For what?" "To write out the disclosure terms before they arrive. So the conversation at 6 o'clock is about their adjustments to my document, rather than building from nothing. You control a negotiation by controlling the first draft." She looked at him. "That's something Thomas taught me." She went to the backroom table with the notebook and the pen, and she wrote for 2 hours without stopping. And when she finished, she had 4 pages of clean, precise language that said exactly what Raymond Cross would confirm, and exactly what it would cost him, and exactly what it would cost the men behind him, and not one word of it was negotiable in any way that mattered. Carver and Cross arrived at 6. The negotiation lasted 90 minutes. Carver changed 11 words. Hazel allowed 4 of the changes and declined the other 7, with specific legal reasoning for each refusal that Carver could not counter without contradicting the territorial code he'd cited in his own objection that afternoon. At 7:45, Raymond Cross signed the disclosure document in Nora's back room with Frank Aldridge as witness, and Nora Sung and Cole Whitaker and Daniel Whitaker standing at the edges of the room.
And when he set down the pen, the silence that followed was the particular kind that came after something long and wrong had been brought to its end. Frank walked Cross and Carver out. Nora put the kettle on without being asked. Daniel looked at the signed document on the table with the focused expression of a boy understanding, in real time, that paper could in fact do what his father had spent 2 years hoping it could do. Cole stood beside Hazel at the table, not close enough to imply anything that hadn't been said, but present. The same solid, particular presence he'd maintained through every hour of the last 2 days. Steady and purposeful and honest in the way he inhabited whatever space he was in. "The Federal Commission filing," he said. "You're still doing it. Tomorrow morning. Cross's disclosure actually strengthens it. Named principles rather than a corporate shell." She straightened the signed pages. "The court hearing is 22 days out. The commission filing will run parallel. By the time both processes complete, every deed transfer in that cabinet will be voided and re-recorded to the original grantors." She paused. "Those 8 families get their land back." Cole was quiet for a moment. Daniel looked up from the document. "All of them?" Daniel said. "All of them," Hazel said. The boy nodded once, a short, definitive motion that she recognized because she had seen it in his father a dozen times in 2 days. The confirmation of a thing finally resolved, the closing of a shape that had been incomplete. Cole looked at her sideways, and she looked back at him, and in the warm kitchen light of Nora Sung's back room, with the kettle beginning to speak on the stove and the signed disclosure of Raymond Cross on the table between them, something passed between them that was not yet named and did not need to be named tonight. It was enough that it was there. Real things grew at their own pace. She knew that, had always known it, even when she'd forgotten it in the years of managing other people's grief alongside her own. "There's one more thing," Hazel said. She reached into the satchel and pulled out the last page she'd written during her 2-hour preparation. A separate document, clean and precise, addressed to the Territorial Land Registry in Santa Fe. "I filed a claim this afternoon before the courthouse closed. A homestead application." She set it on the table. 160 acres, 6 miles east of Delwood. The parcel adjacent to the Whitaker Ranch that's been sitting unregistered for 4 years because nobody wanted to live next to a fraud investigation. Cole looked at the document, looked at her. "You're staying." "I'm staying," Hazel said. "I came west looking for something permanent. I found something worth building instead, which is better." She picked up her coffee cup. "The Territorial Homestead Act requires 5 years of improvement and residence before the claim is final. I intend to spend those 5 years making sure Raymond Cross's principals understand that federal investigations, once opened, do not close because the original investigator becomes inconvenient to pursue." She looked at Cole directly. "And possibly learning where the fence lines run in this county. I'm told there's someone local who knows them all." Cole looked at her for a long moment. His hand moved to the table, not reaching, just resting near hers, close enough that the warmth of it was there without the declaration of it. And she understood that about him now, that he moved toward things carefully and honestly and without theater, and that what he offered, he meant entirely. 6 miles east," he said. "That puts your eastern boundary on my western line." "I know," Hazel said. "I read the deed description." He almost smiled. That near smile she'd catalogued the first time she'd seen it in his office doorway. The expression of a man whose face had forgotten the full motion, but remembered the direction. "Good land," he said. "Needs work." "Everything worth having does," Hazel said. Nora set cups on the table and sat down and said nothing, because Nora Sung understood that some moments required witnessing rather than commentary. And this was a woman who had spent 20 years understanding exactly what each moment required. Daniel reached for his cup with the careful dignity of a 14-year-old who was trying to sit at an adult table and mostly succeeding. And outside, the November dark had settled full over Delwood with the particular completeness of a night that didn't leave room for half measures. And inside, the lamp burned steady, and the signed disclosure sat on the table, and the homestead claim sat beside it, and Hazel McBride held her coffee with both hands and let the warmth move all the way through. She had come to New Mexico territory with $22 and a dead man's satchel, and the specific kind of determination that forms in a person when everything they've built has been taken legally, and they decide, once and finally, that the law which failed them will instead become the instrument through which they build something no one can take. She had found fraud and fought it with paper, and won. She had found a county of frightened people and given them back the tools to stand. She had found a man who moved toward things honestly, and a boy who was learning to read the world the way it actually was, and a woman who had spent 20 years keeping records of injustice while waiting for someone to walk through her back door with the right questions. She had not come west looking for any of that, but she had come west ready for it, which was the more important thing. And what a woman was ready for was what she built her life from. And the life Hazel McBride was going to build from these materials, this county, this case, this land, these people, was going to be solid and square and true in every corner, and it was going to last.